February 14th, 1949. A florist's box arrives at a house on Tropical Avenue in Beverly Hills, addressed to Hedda Hopper. It is Valentine's Day, and Hedda Hopper receives a great many things on Valentine's Day. She opens it. Inside is a live skunk. The card from the actress Joan Bennett, whom Hedda had written about that week, says, "I stink, and so do you." Bennett had worked out something most of the town had not. The only currency these two women ever dealt in was odor. Not truth, not access, not even information. Just the question of whether a name walked into a room clean or walked in trailing something behind it. America decided the story of Louella Parsons and Hedda Hopper was a catfight. Two elderly women in ridiculous hats throwing insults across Sunset Boulevard for 30 years, feuding over scoops the way children feud over toys. It was covered that way at the time by people who knew better. It has been told that way ever since by people who don't. It wasn't a catfight. It was a hostile takeover, and only one of the two women understood what was actually being taken. Because Louella Parsons had held an unbroken monopoly since the mid-1920s. And by several reported accounts, she had personally given Hedda Hopper a hand up before any of this began. Because Louella's own position rested on a favor so large, it has never been proven and never disproven, involving a dead film director on a yacht in November 1924, and a cremation that happened faster than anyone could ask a question. Because in the spring of 1949, she landed the greatest scoop of her career, and that triumph turned out to be the start of her own end in a way she never saw. Because both women were destroyed at almost the same moment by exactly the same thing, and it was not each other. And because one of them left 43 linear feet of her private working files to a public research library, indexed and open to anybody who books an appointment. It was not the one who won. It started with a dead man on a boat. But before the boat, there was Freeport, Illinois. Louella Rose Oettinger was born there in August 1881 into a Jewish family in a small Midwestern town. Her father died young, and her mother remarried. She spent her entire adult life claiming she had been born in 1893, so if you see that date attached to her, adjust by 12 years and carry on. The habit of editing the record began early with her, and it never stopped. And here's the thing about Louella that gets lost under 6 decades of caricature. She was there first, not first among gossip columnists. First, full stop. In 1914, writing for the Chicago Record-Herald, she began what is generally credited as one of the first regular motion picture columns in an American newspaper. The movies were a disreputable novelty then, and respectable papers would not lower themselves to cover them. She had already sold a scenario to SNA. She published one of the earliest manuals on how to write for the screen. She invented the job she would eventually be mocked for holding. In 1918, she moved to New York and wrote for the Morning Telegraph. In 1922, William Randolph Hearst hired her. Understand what that meant in 1922, because everything after it depends on this. Hearst was not a newspaper. He was a network of them, something approaching 30 dailies at his peak, plus the International News Service, plus King Features, which syndicated content into hundreds of papers he did not even own. To be a Hearst columnist was to appear on the same morning on the breakfast tables of a substantial fraction of literate America, and to do it without ever persuading a single editor of anything. That was Hearst's fortune, Hearst's distribution, and Hearst's protection. None of it was hers. Hold on to that. Every ounce of Louella Parsons' power for the next 30 years was borrowed rather than owned. A loan can be called in, and eventually somebody called it in. Now, the boat. In November 1924, the producer and director Thomas Ince spent a weekend aboard Hearst's yacht, the Oneida, celebrating his birthday. Aboard, by various accounts, were Hearst himself, his mistress Marion Davies, Charlie Chaplin, and others. Ince became ill during the weekend, was taken off the vessel, and died shortly afterward at 44. The official cause was heart failure attributed to acute indigestion. There was no autopsy. The body was cremated quickly. His widow left for Europe. The rumor began almost immediately and has never died in 100 years. Hearst shot him. Hearst caught someone with Marion Davies, fired, and hit the wrong man in the dark. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. And shortly after that weekend, Louella Parsons was given a Hearst contract described, then and since, as extraordinarily generous and extraordinarily long. Was she on that yacht? She denied it consistently for the rest of her life. Various people said otherwise. The record does not settle it, and I am not going to pretend it does. Treat the whole Ince business as what it is, an unproven Hollywood legend, repeated for a century because it is far too good to check. But here is what needs no proving, and it is the only part that matters. Whatever the origin, the arrangement was real. From the mid-1920s onward, Louella Parsons had job security that no working journalist in America had, granted personally by the most powerful publisher in the country. And every single person in the film industry believed there was a reason for it. That belief was the product. She never needed the story to be true. She needed the town to believe Hearst could not fire her. The town believed it, and that belief did more work for her over 30 years than any scoop she ever printed. By the mid-1930s, the whole apparatus was assembled. The column ran everywhere. From 1934, she had a CBS radio program called Hollywood Hotel, on which the biggest stars in the world performed scenes from their forthcoming pictures. For nothing. That is not a flourish. It is the actual arrangement. The studios supplied their contract players to promote their own films, and no performer was paid a cent. It ran 4 years. Then, in 1938, the Screen Actors Guild intervened and demanded that actors be compensated. The economics collapsed, and the program went with them. Remember 1938. Louella lost her radio show that year, and she was about to lose considerably more. Now the other one, and she is nothing like the woman you have been shown. Hedda was born in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, in 1885, into a Quaker family. Her father was a butcher. She ran away to New York to go on the stage, which, in a Quaker household in 1908, was roughly equivalent to announcing a career in armed robbery. She got into chorus lines. In 1913, she married an actor named DeWolf Hopper, famous across America for reciting Casey at the Bat, who was 27 years older than she was. She was his fifth wife. The previous four were named Ella, Ida, Edna, and Nella. He kept confusing them and calling her by the wrong one. So she went to a numerologist and paid, by her own account, $10 for a new first name. What came back was Hedda. Stop on that transaction. It is the entire woman compressed into a single afternoon, and it happens 25 years before she writes a word for publication. Hedda did not change her name for glamour. She changed it because a man could not tell her apart from 4 other women. Rather than accept that, she had a replacement identity professionally manufactured on paper for a fee, and then used it for the next 53 years. She understood at 28 that a name is a document, and that documents can be commissioned. Remember that. It eventually explains what she did with a filing cabinet, and the filing cabinet is where this story ends. The marriage ended in 1922. She had one son, William. She went to Hollywood and became an actress, and this part matters more than the rest of her biography. She was a working, employed, entirely competent actress for the better part of 2 decades, and she never got anywhere at all. Over 100 films, society matrons, gossiping friends, the second woman at the dinner table. She was inside the business and never once above the title. And she watched, from 6 feet outside the light, every trick and arrangement and quiet humiliation the system ran on. By the mid-1930s, she was over 50. The parts had dried up, and she was, by her own repeated account, broke. There is a detail here I would flag as reported rather than established. Some accounts say Louella, who knew her socially, gave her a hand up, a recommendation, a word in the right ear, an item passed to a friend who needed the work. Hedda had done a little radio and a little column writing for a Hearst paper before the Los Angeles Times came calling. Whether Louella actively helped or merely tolerated her as a useful source depends on which biography you read, and neither woman was ever a reliable narrator about the other. But the direction of the record is consistent, and the direction is what counts. Before 1938, Louella Parsons regarded Hedda Hopper as a minor acquaintance who occasionally supplied her with things. So, whatever Louella felt after 1938 was not the ordinary irritation of a rival. It was the far less bearable feeling of watching a supplier become a competitor. In February 1938, the Los Angeles Times launched Hedda Hopper's Hollywood. The obvious question is why, and the answer is not personal at all. The Times wanted a Hollywood column and could not have Louella, because Louella belonged to Hearst, and Hearst owned the rival Examiner, so the Times needed a counterweight. It hired a 52-year-old failed actress with no journalistic training and a complete cellular 20-year knowledge of the inside of every soundstage in the county. But the better question is why the studios let it happen. And they did let it happen. A column of that kind cannot survive a week without cooperation, and the cooperation arrived immediately. They let it happen because a monopoly is expensive. For 22 years, Louella had been the only door, and the price of being the only door is total. If she wanted an exclusive, she got it. If she was crossed, there was nowhere else in the world for a publicity chief to go. Louis B. Mayer and Harry Cohn and Jack Warner were not sentimental men and had no views about the freedom of the press. They had simply spent 2 decades paying a toll to a single operator. A second operator meant a bidding war, and in a bidding war, the seller sets the price, and the seller was the studio. So this was never 2 women who happened to loathe each other. This was a market deliberately opened by the people who supplied both of them with their entire inventory. The feud was a product with sponsors from the first week. Both were paid handsomely to perform it, and neither ever stopped. What did each bring to it? Louella had scale, security, and the particular fear that came off the Hearst name. She also had genuine reporter's instincts, which gets badly underrated because she ended her life as a punchline. Her informant network had been built patiently over 2 decades, and it ran through the parts of Los Angeles nobody else thought to look at. Admitting clerks at hospitals, nurses, hairdressers, receptionists in doctors' offices, secretaries and drivers, and through her third husband, the medical apparatus of the industry itself. She married Harry Martin in 1930, a physician who worked for 20th Century Fox. Part of what a studio doctor did in that period was quietly manage the venereal disease, the abortions, the pregnancies, and the addictions of an entire contract roster. He was, by every surviving account, a spectacular drunk. The standing joke the town told about him was cruel, unprintable, and entirely about the volume of what he knew. So Louella's pipeline ran through the medical files of a major American film studio. That isn't gossip. That's an intelligence source with a physician's signature on it. Hedda had none of that and never built it. What she had was 20 years of standing at the edge of other people's scenes, watching who arrived with whom, who was frightened, who was drinking before lunch, who was finished and had not yet been told. She knew the business as labor rather than glamour, from underneath rather than across the table. And she was, by universal agreement, including from people who despised everything she stood for, funnier and a better writer than her rival ever was. She had one further asset that took 9 years to become visible, probably including to her. She had no employer who could be leaned on, no proprietor's protection, and therefore no proprietor's leash, which meant that when she eventually found her own source of power, nobody in Hollywood had the slightest idea what to do about it. The machine years are the part everyone thinks they know, so let me do the surface quickly and then get behind it. Two rival courts. Hedda, in a house she herself nicknamed the house that fear built, in hats so enormous they became a national joke, a joke she then escalated deliberately, year after year, because she had learned as an actress that the second woman at the dinner table survives by being the only recognizable silhouette in the frame. Louella at her own table with her own circle, both claiming readerships in the tens of millions, both with radio, both with telephones that studio publicity men answered on the first ring at any hour. Underneath, the mechanics were simple and industrial. An item was a currency, and it moved in trade. An engagement, a pregnancy, a contract signing, a rift, a reconciliation, these belonged in practice to whichever columnist the studio had decided to reward that month and were withheld from the other as punishment. In exchange, the columnists provided a service no studio could buy anywhere else at any price. They buried things. What got killed always mattered more than what got printed. An arrest that never appeared. A marriage that was quietly the third one. A sexuality that went unmentioned across 40 years of daily coverage of a man's private life by two women who knew the whole time and were, on that one subject, absolutely reliable. Now look behind it, because this is where the standard telling goes soft and lets everybody off. These two were not covering an industry. They were an enforcement arm of it. The studios knew it, the columnists knew it, and the arrangement was profitable to every party except the audience, which was the only party not in on it. That is not journalism with poor manners. That's the publicity department with a byline. And the fear that made it work was not fear of embarrassment. Every significant actor, writer, and director in Hollywood was on a personal 7-year contract containing a morals clause, a written clause permitting the studio to terminate you for conduct that brought the company into disrepute, which meant a columnist who could manufacture disrepute on a Tuesday morning could effectively fire a human being by Wednesday afternoon, not through influence, through trigger. Each of these women held a functioning indirect ability to end anyone's employment in the picture business, and the instrument that granted it had been signed voluntarily by the person they were pointing it at. Then, in 1947, Hedda Hopper found something better than a morals clause. This is the center of the story, and it is not a scoop and not an insult, and it did not happen in Hollywood. It happened in a hearing room in Washington, and what it amounted to was a change of currency. In 1944, a group inside the industry formed the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals to combat communist and subversive influence in the film business. Hedda was involved from early on. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee opened hearings on Hollywood. Friendly witnesses testified. 10 unfriendly ones went to prison for contempt. The Waldorf statement followed, in which the studios announced they would not knowingly employ a communist, and the blacklist came into being. In 1950, a publication called Red Channels listed names in radio and television, and the machine reached its final form. An accusation never tested in any court could now remove a person from an entire industry indefinitely, with no mechanism of appeal. Hedda Hopper was among that machine's most enthusiastic public operators. She named people in print, repeatedly, over years. She ran a long campaign against Charlie Chaplin that wound through his paternity trial, his politics, and his refusal to take American citizenship. And that ended in effect when he was barred from re-entering the United States in 1952. She pursued others for petition signatures for meetings attended a decade earlier, for the associations of relatives. She was proud of all of it, and said so in print for the rest of her life. Louella was a conservative Catholic convert with no sympathy for communism, who ran the occasional loyal item, but she was fundamentally, fatally uninterested. Her subject was who was in love with whom. Politics bored her, and more to the point, She could not see what it was for. That failure of vision is the hinge this entire rivalry turns on, and I don't believe she ever consciously understood it. So let me put it plainly. Louella's power was access. Hedda's new power was ideology. Those two things behave completely differently under pressure. Access is granted, which means access can be withdrawn. Louella's position depended on the goodwill of one publisher and the cooperation of 8 studios. Every ounce of it was on loan from people who could stop lending. Ideology is a constituency. By 1950, Hedda Hopper had won. Congressmen, veterans organizations, church groups, the American Legion, and several 100,000 readers who agreed with her and would have written letters to any paper that dropped her. No studio could punish her, because punishing her meant being accused of protecting subversives in a decade when that accusation was terminal. Louella could be fired at any time. Hedda could not be touched. That's not a rivalry. That's one woman finding a different power supply and plugging into it, while the other keeps working the telephones exactly as she has since 1922. And here is the piece that makes it personal, and that explains the texture of the hatred better than any insult they traded in public. Louella Parsons was Jewish by birth, in an industry built and run by Jewish immigrants, at a moment when the campaign her rival had joined was routinely accused, with justification in its uglier corners, of running partly on anti-Semitism. Hedda's surviving correspondence contains material on the subject that historians who have worked through the collection describe as unpleasant. I won't characterize documents I haven't read, and her defenders have argued about interpretation for 60 years, but the structural point stands without a single quotation. Louella had spent her professional life inside the film colony's Jewish establishment. The movement that had just made her rival permanently untouchable was one that establishment had every reason to fear. She was not merely losing market share. She was watching a competitor become bulletproof by joining something that regarded Louella's own world as the problem. There is no way to be gracious about that, and she never was. If this is landing for you, subscribe, because the last third is where both of them lose everything, and the manner of the losing is nothing like what anyone expected. Which brings us to 1949 and Louella's greatest single moment, which was also the last time she was ever unambiguously ahead. Ingrid Bergman was then the most respectable star on earth, Joan of Arc, a nun in one picture, an Academy Award. The actress American mothers approved of without reservation. She went to Italy to make a film with Roberto Rossellini and did not come back. Hedda got to her first. She interviewed Bergman, asked directly about the rumors, received a denial that she was pregnant, and printed the denial as fact. Days later, in April 1949, Louella Parsons broke the story that Ingrid Bergman was carrying Rossellini's child. That is one of the great scoops in the history of American entertainment reporting. Louella got it the way she got everything, out of the medical and domestic underground of a company town, where she had been cultivating sources since before Hedda had a byline. It ran in every paper in the country. It ended Bergman's American career for the better part of a decade, and she was denounced on the floor of the United States Senate as a powerful influence for evil. And it left Hedda Hopper standing in public holding a printed denial that had turned out to be false. For a columnist, that is the professional equivalent of being caught in the wrong bed. Louella won that one outright. Now watch what winning it was worth. Ingrid Bergman returned to America in the late 1950s and won a second Academy Award, and the scandal receded into the noise of a changed decade. By then, the real business underneath both women had been dismantled beneath them by forces neither had anything to do with and neither ever properly understood. In 1948, the Supreme Court's paramount decision forced the studios to divest their theater chains, and the vertically integrated system began coming apart. Television arrived and gutted the audience. The 7-year contract went, and the morals clause with it. Stars became free agents with their own attorneys, their own publicists, eventually their own production companies. And the moment an actor stopped being an employee who could be dismissed at a studio's discretion, a gossip columnist stopped being able to threaten anyone. The trigger they had been pulling for 30 years was attached to a weapon that no longer existed. The whole apparatus, the fear, the burials, the trade in items, the phone answered on the first ring, had always been a function of the contract system, not of the two women operating inside it. They were the enforcement arm of a machine. When the machine was disassembled, the arm went with it. Both spent their final decade unable to accept it because both had come to believe the power was theirs personally. It never was. It was the studio's. It was lent out, and the loan expired. Louella's protection failed first, and it failed exactly the way I told you it would. William Randolph Hearst died in August 1951. What survived him was a business run for solvency by executives, not a personal empire run for the pleasure of a proprietor. Whatever the arrangement had been, and remember, nobody has ever proven what it was an understanding between Louella Parsons and one specific man. That man was now in a mausoleum in Colma. Her position eroded slowly across the 50s. Her hearing went. Her copy slipped. There were quiet arrangements involving assistants and ghostwriting that the trade knew about and did not print. Harry Martin died the same year as Hearst. She drank, and she became the one thing that is genuinely fatal in a company town, which is a joke told affectionately. Her malapropisms circulated as entertainment at parties she had not been invited to. Her 1944 memoir, which she titled The Gay Illiterate, as a piece of self-deprecating charm, gave the town a phrase it repeated back to her for 20 years, with a rather different emphasis than the one she intended. She wrote her final column in 1965 at 84, after roughly half a century of continuous publication. There is no evidence anybody made much of a fuss about it. Hedda kept going and was still writing when she died, and she was still doing damage. In 1963, she published The Whole Truth and Nothing But, and the British actor Michael Wilding sued her over a passage in it and won. That case is worth noting because it's the one occasion the machine failed her in the ordinary legal way. A man objected in a court in front of a judge, and the court agreed with the man. Hedda Hopper died on February 1, 1966, of double pneumonia. She was 80. Louella outlived her by nearly 7 years, and this is the cruelest fact in the story, and there is nothing satisfying in it. By 1966, she was in no condition to appreciate that she had outlasted her rival. She spent her last years at the motion picture country home in Woodland Hills, the industry's own retirement facility, in decline. And by most accounts, she was not reliably oriented to the world around her for a considerable stretch of it. She died there on December 9, 1972, at 91. She won. She was the last one standing, and she could not be told. And there was nobody left who thought it worth telling her. Now the twist, which has been sitting in a library in Beverly Hills for 60 years, in plain sight of everyone who has ever written about either of them. When Hedda Hopper died, her files went to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The Hedda Hopper papers at the Margaret Herrick Library span 1901 to 1966, with the bulk falling between the late 1940s and the mid-1960s, and run to 43.3 linear feet. Her personal files, relating almost exclusively to her work as a columnist and to her social life, including interview transcripts and correspondence, arranged into production files, television files, radio files, subject files, clippings, columns, travel, biography, scrapbooks, and photographs. They are available to researchers by appointment, and the property rights to the physical objects belong to the library. UCSB Library, UCSB Library. Read that inventory again, slowly. The finding aid describes it in the flat, neutral language archivists use for everything, and the flatness disguises what it is. That is the complete working archive of a professional destroyer of reputations. deposited intact, cataloged, cross-referenced, and open to the public, in the official research library of the Academy Awards. Almost every historian who has written seriously about the studio system, the blacklist, the fan magazines, or the manufacture of American celebrity has sat in that reading room and gone through Hedda Hopper's boxes, the letters people wrote to her, the transcripts of what stars actually said before it was printed, the private correspondence of an era in which almost nothing else private survives at all. Now, where is Louella's? There is material. There are collections. There are the 2 memoirs, which are ghost-assisted, self-serving, and wrong about her own birth year, which tells you roughly how much they can be trusted about anything else. But there is no comparable body, no working files of a 50-year career, no 43 feet of correspondence and transcripts and kept paper that would let anybody reconstruct what she knew or how she knew it. The woman who was first, who invented the job, who held it alone for 22 years, who broke the biggest story either of them ever broke, and who outlived her rival, left the historians almost nothing to work with. The woman who arrived second at 52, with no training and no protection, kept everything and gave it to a library. Of course she did. Go back to 1913 and the numerologist and the $10. Elda Furry learned before she was 30 that identity is a paper product, and that whoever holds the paper holds the person. That is the founding fact of her entire life. She spent 25 years watching from the edge of the frame. Then she spent 28 years accumulating documents on everyone in the room. Then she deposited the collection somewhere permanent, where nobody could burn it and nobody could edit it. That is not sentiment, and it is not carelessness. It's the same instinct that bought the name. And here's the part that ought to bother you. Hedda Hopper's papers are among the most useful sources we have for the period, and every item in them was collected by a woman with a documented, unapologetic agenda, who ruined people deliberately and who was frequently wrong. She printed a false denial from Ingrid Bergman. She was sued over a passage in her own book and lost. That material is not neutral evidence. It is the operational file of an interested party. We use it because it is what survived, and what survived, survived because she decided it should. She lost the Bergman story. She died first, and she wrote the record. There is a counter-archive, and it belongs to the people they wrote about. The stars outlived them, and the stars talked. Everything now understood about the mechanics of that era, the studio doctor, the buried arrests, the trade in items, the morals clause as a weapon, the specific fear of a phone call from either woman, is known because actors and writers and publicists gave interviews and wrote memoirs in the 60s and 70s and 80s. After the contracts had expired, after the columns had stopped, and after there was nobody left with the power to punish them for it. The blacklisted got their credits back, some of them decades late, some posthumously, and the 2 women who helped keep a great many of them out of work are now, in most tellings, a pair of hats in a documentary. So look at the hats again. Hedda's absurd, escalating, deliberately ridiculous hats, the wagon wheels, the birds, the ones she commissioned specifically to be photographed in, the one she named her memoir after. For 80 years, those hats have been the shorthand for this whole story, a comic prop, proof that these were harmless old eccentrics, and the entire business was silly. But follow what that hat actually did. It was invented by a woman who had spent 20 years as the unrecognizable second face in other people's scenes, married to a man who called her by 4 other women's names. It solved a specific professional problem, which was that nobody could pick her out of a photograph. It made her the only silhouette in any frame she stood in. It made her look harmless while she compiled files on people's political associations, and it is still working right now, today. The hat is the reason you remember her as funny, rather than as a person who helped remove hundreds of people from their livelihoods without a hearing. The hat was camouflage, and it has outlasted everybody who could have said so. Louella Parsons got there first, held it for 22 years, broke the bigger story, and outlived her rival by 7 years. Hedda Hopper got 43 feet of shelf space in the library of the Academy Awards, and the shelf, not the column, is the thing that's still telling us what happened.